Okay, we got to iteration statements. If you have done programming before, you know that pretty much every programming language has a set of iteration statements which are used for repeatedly executing a sequence of statements. In C#, we have 4 iteration statements: for each, while, and do while. So let's examine the syntax for each of these iteration statements. For loops have 3 parts. Here's the first part, semicolon, second part, semicolon, and the third part. The first part is what we call the initialization clause, and that's where we create a counter for controlling the number of times the loop will be executed. So here I have created a counter called I and set it to 0. You're free to use any names for your counter variables, but I is a common convention. The second part is what we call the condition clause. So the for loop here will be executed as long as this condition is valid. And the third part is what we call the iteration clause. And here we typically increment or decrement the counter variable. So here, because I set I to 0, I would increment I in every iteration until it reaches 10. And inside the body of the for block, we have a sequence of statements that will execute repeatedly. For each is used to iterate over elements of an enumerable object. What do I mean by enumerable? In simple words, that means anything that has some kind of list or array nature. So far, you have learned about arrays and strings. A string, as you know, is a sequence of characters. So a string is enumerable. The array type is also enumerable. So anything that has some kind of list nature is enumerable, and we can use for each to iterate over their elements. We can definitely do the same thing with a for loop, but doing that with for each is easier and cleaner. In terms of syntax, here is what a for each block looks like. We have a local or temporary variable, in this case I call it number, and here we have the in keyword, and here is the list or object that we are iterating. So assuming that numbers is an array of integers, in every iteration, number will hold the value in the current element of the array. In C# we also have while loops. In terms of syntax, a while loop includes a condition here, in parentheses. As long as this condition is valid, the loop will execute. Typically, we have a counter that we initialize before the while loop is executed, and at the end of the while loop, we increment it. So as you see, it's kind of similar to for loop, but it has a different syntax. Whether you use for or while loop, it's up to you. It's kind of personal preference. And finally, we have do while loops. Do while is slightly different from while loop. With do while loop, the loop is executed at least once, because the condition is evaluated at the end of the loop. So here we have do, a block of statements that will execute. We have our counter, which we increment or decrement, and eventually is the condition. Now, you don't always need a counter with while and do while loops. You can use any condition. In the slides here, I used a counter called I to demonstrate that the same thing can be implemented with a for, with a while, or with a do while loop. And finally, before we start coding, let me show you 2 more statements here. We have break and continue. So in any loops, we can use break to jump out of the loop or continue to jump to the next iteration. Now let's start coding and see what all of this means in action.